In the summer of 1969, two Central American nations went to war over a game of football. It was a clash that had been brewing for decades, fueled by social, economic, and political tensions. It was a war that claimed thousands of lives, displaced tens of thousands more, and left a legacy of bitterness and resentment. This is the story of the Football War, also known as the Soccer War, or the 100 Hours War, between El Salvador and Honduras. The Football War was triggered by a series of matches between the national teams of El Salvador and Honduras, as part of the qualifying rounds for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. Both countries had never reached the final stage of the tournament before and were eager to make history, but the stakes were much higher than just a sporting glory. The matches became a symbol of the deep-rooted animosity and rivalry that existed between the two neighbors, who shared a long and disputed border and a history of migration and conflict. El Salvador and Honduras are among the smallest and poorest countries in Latin America, with high population densities and scarce natural resources. For decades, Salvadoran peasants had been crossing the border into Honduras in search of land and work, escaping the oppression and inequality of their own country, where a small elite controlled most of the wealth and power. By 1969, there were an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras, making up about 10% of the population. Many of them settled on lands that were claimed by Honduran peasants, who were also struggling for land reform and social justice. The presence of the Salvadoran immigrants sparked resentment and hostility among the Hondurans, who saw them as invaders and competitors. The situation worsened in 1966, when the Honduran government, under pressure from the landowning class and the U.S. fruit companies, passed a new law that aimed to redistribute the land occupied by the Salvadorans and deport them back to their country. Thousands of Salvadorans were evicted from their homes and forced to leave behind their crops and belongings. Some of them resisted and clashed with the Honduran authorities and militias. The Salvadoran government protested and accused Honduras of violating the human rights of its citizens. The diplomatic relations between the two countries deteriorated and the border disputes intensified. The tension reached a boiling point in June 1969 when the football matches between El Salvador and Honduras took place. The first match was held in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, on June 8th. The home team won 1-0 amid a hostile atmosphere where the Salvadoran players and fans were insulted, harassed, and attacked by the Honduran crowd. The second match was held in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, on June 15th. The home team won 3-0 in a game that was marked by violence and vandalism, where the Honduran players and fans were assaulted, stoned, and burned by the Salvadoran mob. The third and decisive match was held in Mexico City on neutral ground on June 26th. The game was tied 2-2 after 90 minutes and went into extra time. In the 101st minute, El Salvador scored the winning goal and qualified for the World Cup. The final whistle unleashed a wave of jubilation and rage as the Salvadoran fans celebrated and the Honduran fans lamented. The football matches had become a nationalistic and emotional outlet for the frustrations and grievances of both sides. The next day, on June 27th, El Salvador broke off diplomatic ties with Honduras and accused it of mistreating and expelling its citizens. It demanded that Honduras stop the deportations, compensate the victims, and guarantee their safety and rights. Honduras rejected the demands and claimed that El Salvador was interfering in its internal affairs and inciting violence and rebellion. The war of words soon escalated into a war of weapons as both countries mobilized their armed forces and prepared for a confrontation. On July 14th, El Salvador launched a surprise attack on Honduras, with its air force bombing the main cities and airports and its army invading the border regions. The Salvadoran troops outnumbered and outgunned the Honduran forces and advanced rapidly into the Honduran territory, capturing several towns and villages. The Honduran army, supported by the Nicaraguan government, tried to resist and counterattack, but was unable to stop the Salvadoran offensive. The Honduran Air Force, however, managed to inflict some damage on the Salvadoran planes and infrastructure and shot down several of their aircraft. The war lasted for 4 days until July 18th, when the Organization of American States, a regional body that promotes peace and cooperation, intervened and brokered a ceasefire. The OAS sent a peacekeeping force to monitor the truce and urged both countries to withdraw their troops and resume diplomatic talks. The Salvadoran government agreed to pull back its forces, but only after Honduras guaranteed the safety and rights of the Salvadoran immigrants. The Honduran government accepted the condition, but only after El Salvador recognized its sovereignty over the disputed border areas. The war was officially over, but the peace was fragile and uneasy. The Football War was one of the shortest and bloodiest wars in Latin American history. It claimed the lives of more than 2,000 soldiers and civilians and injured and displaced thousands more. It also caused severe economic and social damage to both countries and worsened their already precarious situation. The war did not resolve the underlying issues that caused it, but rather deepened the hatred and mistrust between the two nations. The border disputes remained unresolved, and the Salvadoran immigrants remained vulnerable and marginalized. The war also had a lasting impact on the regional stability and security, as it contributed to the rise of political violence and civil wars that plagued Central America in the following decades. The Football War was a tragic and senseless conflict that showed how a game of football can ignite a war, but not end it. It was a war that could have been avoided if the two countries had addressed their problems peacefully and cooperatively instead of resorting to force and aggression. It was a war that taught a bitter lesson that no one wins a war and that everyone loses. It was a war that should never be forgotten and never be repeated.